Hello, everyone. So nice to see you today and welcome to this webinar. I'm Dr. Lucy Hone and I am broadcasting from New Zealand to you today. So in New Zealand it is lunchtime and I'm very aware that it is later in the evening and 5 p.m. on the west coast of the States. So wherever you're coming from, welcome. I'm going to talk you through my work and my relationship with this subject, resilient grieving, which for me has evolved over the last, I think, 6 years now, but it of course is particularly pertinent right now as we all navigate the stresses and challenges and myriad of losses that COVID-19 is wreaking all over the world. So I'm going to share my screen and let's get started. I'm going to talk for about half an hour and then there's going to be time for questions at the end. So just briefly to introduce myself, I'm Dr. Lucy Hone. I'm an adjunct fellow at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand, and I'm also a co-founder and co-director of the New Zealand Institute of Wellbeing and Resilience. And I have various other kind of roles I play, some of which I'm going to discuss with you throughout today's webinar. So just to get started, let me just click through here. My relationship, I have a pretty unique relationship with resilience. It started over 10 years ago now, when I went to the University of Pennsylvania, as no doubt many of you did. And this webinar series is brought to you from the MAPP grads of that program at UPenn, which is the Masters in Applied Positive Psychology. I went because I was already fed up with people talking about resilience, and I was pretty sure that I wanted to know what we actually knew. You know, I felt like already it was a word that was bandied around a great deal, and I didn't really believe that most people who were using this word actually knew what it meant. So I commuted between New Zealand and Philadelphia 11 times during that master's program, which was pretty hectic, but also really amazing. And so that is where I got my academic training in resilience research, essentially from Karen Rivich. And so I'm going to talk a bit about her work today and Judy Salzberg. And when I was there, I was lucky enough to be there during the time that Penn had picked up the contract to train all 1.1 million US soldiers to be as mentally fit as they always have been physically fit. So for someone like me whose main quest in life is, my main curiosity is, how can we take the best of findings out of academia? How can we use that science to inform us in our everyday lives? But what I really like is not just translating the science into practice, but doing so in a really pragmatic, practical way. So when I just come back from Philadelphia in 2011 and had just embarked on my own doctoral research here at Auckland University of Technology, when the right-hand picture, the Christchurch earthquakes hit. This is my adopted hometown of Christchurch. As some of you might guess from my accent, I'm not originally from here. I'm actually a Londoner, born and bred, but I have been living here for 20 years now. So as far at the time in 2011, Christchurch was not known for the many fault lines that we now know live beneath us. And so on that day in February 2011, we had the most terrible earthquake right underneath our city. You can see by this photo here, that is what is left of the city, and that awful dust cloud is from the buildings falling around. So that then gave me, it kind of changed my work in that I put my doctoral research on hold for a bit and went about doing exactly what Karen and Judy and co have been doing in Philadelphia by translating the science to be useful to people in their everyday lives. Only my population was my local community. So I put that research on hold and spent much of 2011 working with my local community to help them understand the ways that thinking and acting in a resilient way could actually help them get back on their feet during that awful 2 or 3 really awful years, but we're still rebuilding the city even a decade later. So it was my first experience of disaster management and those long-term recovery lines that are going to sadly become so familiar to us all as we progress forward through the COVID pandemic. And so I thought that was my calling. It was pretty terrible. We had over 5 really big earthquakes and 10,000 aftershocks here in Christchurch. And I experienced anxiety for the first time in my life. You never knew when they were going to hit. You never knew where you were going to be and whether you were going to be safe. I thought that was my calling. And some of you know, sadly, I was wrong, because this beautiful picture at the bottom of the screen here is Lake Ohow Lodge in the South Island of New Zealand, where we had travelled as a family on Queen's birthday weekend in June 2014 to go mountain biking in the beautiful great outdoors of New Zealand with 2 other families. And at the last minute, my dear wee girl Abby hopped in the car with her best friend Ella, and Ella's mum Sally, who was also a dear friend of mine. And on the way down, there was a terrible accident, and a driver sped through a stop sign and ploughed into them and killed all 3 of them. So why do I tell you this? I think for a long time after the girls died, I wasn't so open about this. I think it really took me probably 18 months to 2 years to be able to talk publicly about it. Now we are 6 years later, and I am kind of compelled to tell my story for a couple of reasons, really. And one is that if I've learned anything over the last 6 years, it is this, that to a greater or lesser extent, we all have to cope with adversity in our lives. And I truly believe, along the lines of what Viktor Frankl said in his Man's Search for Meaning book all those years ago, that while we cannot control our circumstances, we can, to a greater or lesser extent, control our response to those circumstances. And I feel really fortunate in many ways that I had that training in Philadelphia, that I'd done that MAPP program, because having done so, I knew, I'd seen the research, I'd been in the lectures, and I really understood that resilience comes from how we choose to think and how we choose to act. Certainly there are times where our environment, can make that really extra challenging. And I am very aware that there are lots of people right now who are homebound in isolation, in circumstances that are far from good, in which case you can't just think and act your way out of those. So environment does, of course, play a role here. And so does biology to a greater or lesser extent. But the reality is your genes are not your destiny. It's all about how the environment and the way that we develop our genetic makeup that makes the real difference here. So this is what happened to me. I was told within a few days of the girls dying that we were now prime candidates for divorce, family estrangement, and mental illness. And I remember thinking, wow, that's not very helpful. And actually, I really want to do everything I possibly can to help me recover from this loss. I want to work out whether all that material that I'd been trained in at the University of Pennsylvania is in any way helpful to me now when I was really pitted against the very worst circumstances, days and weeks of our lives. Parental bereavement is known to be the very worst form of bereavement. And so I decided to conduct, if you like, a self-experiment, again using Viktor Frankl's words. I wanted to see if this research and training that we'd experienced in the MAPP program would be useful when applied to the bereavement context. Because what struck me when I started reading all the grief literature, all those pamphlets that we were handed, and then later as I delved into the Death International and Death Studies Journal, what really struck me was that it became readily apparent that the fields of positive psychology research, resilience research, and the field of bereavement, like good old academic silos, had never really started talking to each other. So bereavement research was largely telling you what you were going to experience, all of those physical and emotional reactions, but there was so little about what we could do to help ourselves. So in the face of that, as I say, I decided to conduct something of my own experiment, and I started writing a blog. Now, I'm a writer, so no doubt some of you here today are also writers. And the funny thing about being a writer is that that's how I make sense of the world. So when faced with so much confusion and overwhelmed by misery, I knew that my personal best way out was to just start writing about what I was experiencing. And what I wanted to do in this blog, which was my original blog, really, I started it 2 weeks after Abby died. It's no longer around, but what I wanted to do was just start testing which of the theories that come out of positive psychology would be helpful to me as I went about navigating my grief process. So the blog quickly had over 100,000 views, which meant it got turned into a book. When I finished my PhD in 2015, I wrote this book called Resilient Grieving. That's the left-hand one. The yellow one is the American version, and the right-hand one is the New Zealand and Australian, and I think that's the one that they sell in England too version. So it's widely available online, and it's on Kindle. And what you'll see if you pick up a copy of this book is, firstly, actually the best input I ever get from feedback I get from people is they say to me that it was an easy read and it gave them hope. And so if I've done that only, then I'm really glad that that book does that. I wrote it with the bereaved in mind, knowing that when you're bereaved, you don't have, infinite sources of focus and attention. So they're short chapters, and it's written very much with a lay audience in mind as well, but with this bedrock of academic evidence-based theories and research. There's also lots of case studies. I didn't want it to all be about me, so I dragged lots of other researchers and practitioners and lots of my MAPP colleagues too into there to get their best advice. So let me just, having told you my own story and why this work is so important to me, let me now just tell you, I'm just going to give you some top line findings that we have that have come out of academia, which can inform us about resilient grieving. So the first is that, this is Karen Reivich's definition, that resilience is about coping with difficulty and adversity, but I also love the fact that she says, and learning from it. That's the bit that really resonates with me. So heads up, thanks for that, Karen. And also I often refer to Anne Marston's work. She was one of the earliest researchers in the field of resilience. And I love that she says, it really requires very ordinary magic, very ordinary processes. And I'm going to list some of these for you a little later on. But I like to think that although it's very ordinary processes, the magic is actually what the science gives us. It's that extra layer. So lots of these processes are pretty ordinary. They're about relying on your friends, choosing where you focus your attention, looking after yourself, getting outside, and a bit about positive emotions. But what I like is that every time it is the science, I think that gives us that extra really nuanced layer, which takes it beyond just self-help. So we know that our resilience is massively influenced by how we choose to think and how we choose to act, which means it kind of pays to have high levels of self-awareness and start understanding what makes you feel good and function well, what helps and harms you. And then you have to really deliberately act intentionally over and over again to help yourself, particularly when we are navigating tough times. And best of all, there are several studies that show that not only can we teach resilience, but actually it can be learned. So work from Karen Rivich, Marty Seligman, Tayeb Rashid and others, Jane Gillan, shows that if we apply these ways of thinking and acting, they are associated with less depression, more happiness, higher levels of life satisfaction. And now we have some new researchers in this field, such as George Bonanno and Tom Attig and Dennis Charney and Pete Southwick, who are all showing that actually, if you apply these ways of thinking and acting, they will help you through bereavement. So I'm just going to share with you quickly now Dennis Charney's study that he did with American airmen who were held in the Hanoi Hilton during the Vietnam War, some of them for 6 years. And he did long form interviews with these airmen. Particularly, he was interested in the airmen who didn't come down with post-traumatic stress or depression in the years subsequent to their imprisonment. And from doing those long form interviews, these are the common characteristics he discovered that those airmen who had shown their resilience and proved to go on and live full and functioning lives, this is what they all had in common. I'm just going to click through these now. Optimistic thinking, but realistic optimistic thinking, not Pollyanna runaway wisdom, optimism. So I hope you can see here what we mean by ordinary processes, ordinary magic. None of these really require rocket science. And what I like is that, as Karen Rivich always used to say to us, that resilience is a stew. It's a whole manner of ingredients, of different ways of thinking and acting, of leaning on your strength, of really working hard to maintain those strong, supportive relationships, on having a survivor's mission, on realistic optimism, as I said earlier on. So those are the common characteristics of resilience. But I also want to share with you now some of George Bonanno's work. So when I started writing about resilient grieving, and when effectively I started to kind of form this construct of resilient grieving, the more and more literature I read about bereavement and the grief experience, the more appalled I was to discover that how little insights, empirical insights into hope and resilience and self-efficacy and strengths and relationships had really made their way into bereavement research. It seemed to me that once I started reading the bereavement literature, it painted a really dark picture of victimology. And so I was totally delighted to stumble upon George Bonanno's research. So George's book, The Other Side of Sadness, I think it's called. I'm going to have to come back. You'll have to check that out, George Bonanno. it really resonated with me. And best of all, he has dedicated his life to looking at who has resilience and taking an epidemiological approach. One of the things that I really appreciated was a growing understanding from him that the reason the bereavement literature was so pathologizing and painted such a dark picture was that most bereavement studies had traditionally been conducted on those people who were experiencing delayed or chronic or complicated grief. I didn't mean delayed, I meant just chronic or complicated grief. So basically, all of the studies that were informing the bereavement literature have been conducted on people who were really struggling with bereavement, meaning that we had a pretty biased, warped view of what the common experience was. So I was delighted to find George's work, and his work shows that actually most people are resilient in the face of loss. Lots and lots of studies that he has conducted, also with the likes of Camille Wortman, and I absolutely respect and value this body of work because it gave me hope that I could survive. So their studies show that over 50% of people usually respond with resilience in response to a whole myriad of losses. This next slide here, don't be scared of it. I just want you to look on the right-hand side of that column of all these different potentially traumatic events. And you can see on the left-hand side, this is a whole range of studies. And in the right-hand side, in that red box, you can see the typical resilience prevalence according to that study. So you can see here, I'm just reading them out, that traumatic injury, that Bryant study, 73% of the sample displayed resilience in the face of a traumatic injury. If you look down that right-hand list, you can say whether it's job loss, whether it's community trauma, whether it is from hurricanes or chronic pain or a mass shooting, the usual response to potentially traumatic events is actually resilience. As Marty Seligman would say, this is actually, what has happened here is a case of academic negligence, where most people have heard of post-traumatic stress disorder, and so few of them have heard of post-traumatic growth. And the same here is true of bereavement. Because the literature is so biased towards those who are actually having a complicated or chronic grief reaction, meaning they're not faring so well and they need clinical intervention, we have grown this picture that most people aren't resilient, whereas actually the very opposite is true. So we can take heart from George and colleagues' work here to know that we do have it within us to get through even the most terrible of losses. In fact, I love the fact that George Bonanno says what surprises him or really kind of piques his curiosity about this research is how surprised people are to discover that we have it within us to be able to navigate all sorts of terrible losses and traumas. So I hope that gives you hope as well. We're not claiming that it's easy to get through these things, and we're not saying that by using positive psychology strategies, you can eliminate grief or you can get rid of negative emotions and all that pining and sorrow and loneliness that you feel when you've lost someone or something. But we are saying that there are ways of thinking and acting that can help you in your healthy adaptation to that loss. So I hope that makes sense. So finally this morning, I just wanted, this morning for me, this evening for you, I wanted to just share with you some of the strategies that I have really relied on. Particularly, I still rely on them, but I know in those first weeks and months after the girls died, these were the strategies when I was being my own experiment that I discovered really did help me get through my darkest days. So I'm going to go through them just one by one here. So the first is that we know from positive psychology research that positive emotions are important. I couldn't find anything about positive emotions in the bereavement literature. Very, very little. Probably did actually find one article that's now springing to mind, but very little indeed. And yet that is so terrible because, of course, grief brings on so many negative emotions. And we're not going to diminish those by resilient thinking. We're still going to experience those negative emotions. But what I really want you to urge you to understand is that positive emotions are important too. They're always important. They're fleeting, but wow, they are powerful. So when you are grieving more than ever, you have to be really, really deliberate in trying to top up your positive emotional quota. Telling people in lots of the training I'm doing, when I talk to people about this, the most common reaction is that they just say, thank you. Thank you for legitimizing and validating the fact that I still want to laugh and sing and sometimes go out with my friends and watch movies and actually experience some positive experiences too. It's okay to do that. You're not in denial and you're not being disloyal to those who you have lost. You're merely adopting a survivor's mission to do whatever it takes to get through this terrible time. So for me, with positive emotions, I remember so distinctly about a month after the girls died, I took a deep breath and decided I would go down to the local school where they were running a kind of a parent lip sync evening. And it's always been known in our community as a right good laugh. And I thought, wow, if ever I need a right good laugh, it is, it is right now. And so, and the other thing about going there particularly was I was kind of able to sneak in, just watch the shows without everybody talking to me and sneak out again. I also remember asking at 2 different times, asking friends if they would go walking with me out into the hills, because I really felt I needed to experience that sense of awe that we know somehow reduces it somehow makes our problems feel smaller, even though we know they're not small. There's something about that kind of shift in perspective that getting out into the really big landscapes, that really works for me. So I urge you to think about all different positive emotions. You can read Barb Fredrickson's book, Positivity, on this, but think about, where do you get your inspiration? Pride. What are you curious in? What about hope? Serenity. Make a real effort. I used to light a candle in the evening and just sit down and have a moment to reflect on my own. So think about all those different positive emotions, and then intentionally and deliberately think about how you can draw these into your lives in a way that feels authentic to you, because what works for you will be different to what works for me. Next is, so the standout finding of wellbeing and resilience research is that nobody goes it alone. We all need other people to rely upon. Dennis Charney, when in his work with the prisoners from the Hanoi Hilton, he talks about the TAP code they developed so that even when they were in solitary confinement, they could still communicate with the inmate in the cell next door. I love his line that everybody needs a TAP code. But also it's important, I do a lot of work with my training. I talk about it in the Resilient Grieving book, and currently we're developing online training for both for people who are bereaved on resilient grieving, and also for helping professionals. So we do a lot of work in, firstly, what can we do as the bereaved to help those around us support us in this trying time? you know, things not to say to the bereaved, for instance, but also how do we communicate, you know, ourselves? So what are the things I need to say? And one of the things I always urge people here is to say to those that are supporting them, you have to tell them what you need. You know, they're not mind readers. They can't just imagine what's going on. It is beholden upon us to be really explicit about what we need. Next is, I think this is really important, and I don't think people really understand enough about this. And actually, I'm not going to have time today to really go into this in much detail, but I just want to bring this notion to you that when we lose someone, there is an opportunity to consider what it is that their loss, that their lives, and learning to live without them can teach us about ourselves. So this is where Bob Niemeyer's work comes in about meaning and making meaning out of the terrible loss that you have had, bringing it into your life and helping make sense. So quick activity here is just to sit down and say, what have they taught you? When my book first came out in New Zealand, we called it What Abby Taught Us, because it was all about what lessons and what insights she had brought into our lives. And then finally, this is also from the MAPP program. Professor Chris Futener talked to us about what are you hoping for now? And he explained that hope is not actually one. We don't just have one big hope, but when things go wrong, it's a really powerful question to ask yourself, to go, okay, the worst thing has happened. What am I hoping for now? And for me, this worked really well at just kind of shifting my goalposts and making me understand and accept that life was really changed, but what was really important to me in my new normal. So those are the 4 strategies. I'm sorry I've run through them so quickly today, but on a half-hour webinar, it's, you know, there's so little you can do. They're all explained more on, this is our website, the New Zealand Institute of Wellbeing and Resilience. The website address there is NZIWR. You can see that the middle podcast here is about me talking about bereavement and resilient grieving. Dr. Denise Quinlan, my colleague, she runs our podcast, and it's coming up to its 4th season now. So there are so many great resources there. And on top of that, that's the copy of my book and the recent TED talk that I did last year, which is all about resilient grieving. So I hope that's helpful to you all. Right, and just stop sharing that and come back to you and see if we've got some Q&A. So now is your time to ask me questions. You can do so through the chat button or the Q&A button. I'm going to pop them on my second screen here, so excuse me looking over to the right. No questions, a silly question, please ask away, and I'll see what I can do. You've all gone very shy. If you find it too hard to ask questions about your own grief, then try and perhaps just make them a bit more general. Or if you would like me to elaborate more on any of the strategies that I passed so quickly through this morning. Maybe I'll just pop my email up here. And oh, here we go. We have some questions. So the first, hang on, let me answer that. So Oriana from the UK, so she's a MAPP graduate from the UK, and wondered if I have any specific ideas about bereavement from suicide. So Oriana, my personal experience and expertise is not in suicide. But having said that, I do read lots of literature about that. So I've just read a piece that is in the Appreciative Inquiry Practitioner that has come out all about the different types of loss. And I think, you know, suicide is such a different thing. Certainly the strategies that I'm talking about here will help you, but I do understand and fully want to respect that it is a very different process. And with my limited personal understanding about it, it isn't something that I want to go into today. I'd rather spend some time, collate some evidence and come back to you on that. So feel free to email me. Let's just have a quick read of some of these Q&As. So Nicolette has asked me about what recommendations would I make to medical professionals suffering the grief of losing patients. The thing is, Nicolette, with grief and in my work, I would be so bold as to say that, I think because you also ask about relating to dealing with their own medical error, that we need forgiveness. It's such an important part of grief. And forgiveness is easiest for some people than others. But what I would say about forgiveness is if you can employ self-compassion to be kind to yourself and forgive yourself, you are doing so much more for your profession in terms of moving on, because forgiveness will allow you to move on and continue to serve. Whereas having that awful blame, really blame just spirals us downwards in a terrible way that really then interferes with our functioning. So I think if you can find it within yourself to forgive, that is a more adaptive process moving forward. So I know that, come on, what's his name? Right here. Let me have a quick look. I'm going to pull this book up and show it to you. Tyab's book on positive psychotherapy, this workbook, has some really good forgiveness activities in it. So let me suggest that. What else? Okay, so somebody has asked me, how do I foresee how we can use these strategies as a community as we deal with collective mourning? So I think we've done quite a lot of work in community resilience, as you can imagine, over the last 10 years living here in Christchurch. And then again, we had the terrible mosque shooting on March the 15th last year. So what I would say about community resilience is that it is built on more than the sum of its parts. You know, there is that connection. It's not just about how we are, how individually resilient we are, but about as a community, we are stronger than our individual selves. So one of the great things that has come out of our earthquakes, which we certainly in New Zealand get a sense will come out of COVID, is people's greater enhanced understanding of the importance of communities in helping each other out, listening to each other, and kindness too. So these strategies in terms of what are you hoping for now, and building relationships and knowing where your strengths are as a community are really, really important as we go forward through this COVID crisis. I've got another question here. Oh, so tough. So Jen has asked me, during this very difficult time of grieving without typical ways of being supported, being with your loved one and able to have a wake or have family and friends surrounding you, how can you support people who are grieving loss from COVID? So I've got a couple of comments to make on this, Jen. And that is, first, my huge sympathy and empathy for anyone who has lost someone to COVID during this time and then is living in lockdown, so they're not able to actually be with the family, with that person. I cannot imagine how tough it is. Even in our own family, my sister's husband has just lost both his parents in England during this time, and he's not, of course, able to travel back to see either of them and not to attend the funerals. So that has really hit home to me. And I think, again, we need to understand that this is just terrible. So feel free to just feel complete remorse and misery and not fairness of that, because truly to lose someone at this time and then not be able to lean upon those traditional ways of commemorating their life and hanging together and, hugging each other, I can't imagine how awful that is. So I think it is firstly really important to recognize that that is an extra dimension to our grief that we cannot underestimate. And then if it was me, I think what resilience tells us is that we need to really be careful over where we focus our attention. So firstly, I would take any kind of blame or guilt out of that equation. There is nothing you can do. These are the rules right now. We are currently still in lockdown in New Zealand, and I know so many other parts of the world are too. I know that varies state to state in America, but for most of us, we are locked down. We are not able to visit our loved ones. We're not able to visit them in a rest home if that's where they're dying, or in hospital. And it is, that is truly paralyzing. So I think it's really important that we are kind to ourselves and accept that there is nothing we can do about that, to accept that it gives us extra hurt and misery, and just go forward knowing that there was nothing different you could have done that would have got a different outcome. Such a tough time to be going through that. I can't see any other questions. I think going back to the collective mourning question, I think it is really important for us to grieve collectively. And one of the things we know about grieving is, as I've said, relationships are so important that you need to be connected when you are grieving. And that need goes on for a long time. So, whether in times like this when you can't physically connect, there is still much opportunity to connect online. And so I would really urge people who are struggling with that, lack of physical contact, to reach out, to determinedly find ways to get yourself online, maybe using FaceTime or currently we're using Zoom. And perhaps all of us could commit to thinking of somebody we would like to help and helping them understand how one of these visual platforms can really help reduce their isolation, because it is such a terrible amplifier when you are grieving. But I also think on top of that, as anybody who's ever grieved knows, grief isn't a temporary short-term thing. There will be months and years to come when we can support each other in our communities through grief. And indeed, there are lots of very supportive communities of grief. For instance, Compassionate Friends, where you can go online to their chat rooms. And then there are others, I've come across in my work, lots of other communities that have sprung up out of one person's grief to serve that particular niche. So there was, I came across, I can't remember what it was called now, for the bereaved widows, I can't quite remember its name, but different Facebook groups that have been created. And there's Mothers Against Drink Drivers, lots of different connectivity around specific grief and losses that helps people who really understand and have experienced that particular type of loss come together during this time. Any other questions? Thanks, Jen, for your comments. If there are no more questions, we might wrap up. So I'll give you another couple of minutes to throw in any questions, but I'm really aware that time is tough for us all right now, and having a whole hour on a webinar, personally, I think is just a little bit too long, a bit of a stretch. So I hope and totally respect and understand that you might well need to be getting back to your normal lives. Normal, she says, normal as they can be. Oh, that's so beautiful, Jen, what you've written about your aunt and uncle coming to the lawn and weeping. It's so hard not being able to throw your arms around someone, I agree. Okay, all. Hang on. Thank you, Nicolette. And I hope that has been helpful. Doing half an hour on the topic of resilient grieving is pretty minimal. And so I hope that you can, the reason I wrote my book was just to get these ways of thinking and acting out there to a wider audience at a really minimal price. So hopefully you can pick it up from a library, or you can get it online from your library. But I hope that that's useful. And as I say, otherwise watch the TED Talk. And from the New Zealand Institute of Wellbeing and Resilience, we will be starting an online course on resilient grieving. First, one for the bereaved specifically, and then one for all manner of helping professionals. And really the bereaved one should be up within a week. So I'm going to sign off now and say thanks very much to you all for coming along today, and for the MAPP community for hosting these webinars. I hope that you can look after yourselves, be kind to yourself, and really stay safe and well as you can through this terribly challenging time. Kia ora from New Zealand.